The sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled me from my work. I looked up from the cedar posts I was setting along the yard of my mountain cabin and froze. Police cruisers, lights flashing, pulled into the lane that led to my family's property. Behind them strutted Karen, the HOA president who had made it her mission to erase every ounce of peace from this valley. Her wide frame swayed with self-importance, her clipboard clutched tight, her voice already barking orders before the deputies had even stepped out of their vehicles. "There he is," she shouted, jabbing her finger toward me as though I were some fugitive caught mid-crime. "He's trespassing, running illegal construction, and storing hazardous materials. I demand you arrest him immediately." The deputies glanced at each other, clearly caught off guard by the theatrics. I stood calmly, wiping the sawdust from my hands, my pulse steady even as fury burned hot in my chest. This wasn't the first time Karen had tried to sic the law on me. She hated that my cabin stood on land the HOA couldn't control. She hated that it was older than her subdivision, older than the bylaws she weaponized against everyone who dared cross her. But this time she had escalated from nasty letters and fines to summoning uniformed officers, trying to humiliate me publicly, to paint me as a criminal on my own soil. I raised my voice so every neighbor watching from their porches could hear. "Officers, welcome. Before we begin, may I ask, did you see any warrants? Any legal paperwork proving her claims?" The deputies shook their heads. Karen sputtered, thrusting forward her clipboard, stuffed with photocopied violations she had typed up herself. One deputy flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with every line. "These aren't official," he muttered. Karen's face flushed crimson, but she recovered quickly, shouting louder. "Don't let him trick you. This whole cabin is an eyesore. He doesn't belong here. We voted him out." I stepped forward, pulling from my pocket the very documents she dreaded most. The original land grant deeds, signed and sealed by the county a century and a half ago. I held them high, the parchment yellowed but unmistakably real. "This cabin was here before any of your houses, before your HOA even existed. I am the legal owner, and your bylaws don't apply on this soil." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The deputies studied the documents carefully, their posture shifting. One turned to Karen. "Ma'am, this proves he has every right to be here. Why did you call us?" Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She jabbed her finger at me again, desperation sharpening her voice. "Because he doesn't follow the community's standards. He built a fence without my approval. He burns wood in that stove and ruins the air quality. He lets strangers visit and it lowers property values." The words spilled faster, shriller, until even her own allies winced at the sound. And then came the twist. From the tree line stepped an older man in a ranger's uniform, his presence commanding in a way that silenced everyone. He introduced himself as Ranger Hollis, head of the county's land preservation department. Unknown to Karen, my cabin yard was not only legally minite, had recently been registered as part of a conservation corridor. Hollis had been working with me for months on a preservation project to protect endangered owls nesting in the pines behind my cabin. He held up a folder thick with paperwork. "This land is under state protection," he announced. "Any interference with it is not only illegal but a federal offense. And I see evidence here of harassment." Karen's face drained of color, but still she tried to bluster. "That's not true. He's bribing you. This is all fake." But the deputies had heard enough. They turned toward me with nods of respect and toward her with hard stares that cut through her bravado. One officer asked Hollis if he wanted to file charges. Hollis nodded. Yes, she made a false police report, interfered with conservation work, and attempted to defraud law enforcement. The scene shifted in an instant. The same woman who had marched in expecting me to be dragged off in cuffs now found herself standing in the center of flashing lights. Her wrists pulled behind her back as deputies clasped cold metal around them. The neighborhood erupted not in shock, but in applause. For years, they had suffered under her rule, her bogus fines, her endless threats. Now they saw her mask torn away, her empire crumbling before their eyes. But the true reckoning was yet to come. News spread fast, faster than even Karen's venom could travel. By nightfall, footage of her screaming at the deputies went viral. Headlines read, HOA president arrested for false police report and cabin land protected by state. HOA overreach exposed. Emails poured in from reporters, environmentalists, even veterans who had stayed in the cabin during community retreats. Everyone wanted to know how one arrogant woman thought she could erase history, and how justice had turned the tables so swiftly. For me, the most powerful moment came 2 days later, when Ranger Hollis returned with a team of conservation officers. They unveiled plans to transform the cabin yard into a community heritage site, a place for education and preservation. The very land Karen had tried to erase was now protected for generations to come. My neighbors, once silent and fearful, joined in planting trees, building trails, and placing markers telling the history of the cabin. Children painted signs that read, "This is our heritage, and truth beats lies." Karen, meanwhile, faced not just charges for filing a false report, but also lawsuits from neighbors who finally found the courage to speak. They brought forth stories of years of extortion, fines, and harassment. One by one, the pieces of her empire collapsed. Her so-called allies abandoned her, her reputation dissolved, and soon she stood alone, stripped of the power she once wielded like a weapon. She had sicked the cops on me, but her plan imploded spectacularly. The days that followed Karen's arrest felt like stepping out of a storm into sunlight. For years her shadow had lingered over the neighborhood, a constant presence of fear and fines. But now the silence was different. It wasn't heavy with dread anymore. It was relief. Neighbors who once hid behind curtains now walked up my gravel path with coffee mugs in hand, shaking their heads, finally speaking openly. "We thought you'd be the one dragged off," old Mr. Whitaker admitted, his voice gravelly but tinged with awe. "Instead, we watched her world collapse in front of everyone." Karen's downfall wasn't quiet. News stations ran the footage on a loop, her voice screeching about conspiracies as deputies led her away. Social media turned her into a meme. One photo showed her pointing furiously at my cabin, captioned, "This is MY Yard now," while another showed her in handcuffs under the words, "Plan imploded." For once, the internet wasn't cruel, it was cathartic. A worldwide laugh at the expense of someone who had built her empire on intimidation. But while she stewed behind bars, her mess rippled outward. The HOA board scrambled to distance themselves, claiming they had no idea what Karen had been doing. Yet evidence surfaced that told a different story. Emails approving her fabricated citations, signatures on her fake bylaws, even financial transfers tied to inflated legal fees that had padded their own pockets. It turned out Karen wasn't just one rogue tyrant, she was the head of a snake that had been feeding itself off our silence. Here came the twist. A former HOA secretary, a woman named Gloria, contacted me quietly one evening. She was nervous, glancing over her shoulder as though Karen might still be lurking in the trees. She confessed that she had been keeping copies of every fraudulent document Karen forced her to type, every memo, every shady transaction. "I couldn't fight her then," Gloria whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "But after what she did to you, to Mrs. Jensen, to all of us, I can't stay quiet anymore." She handed me a battered box of files. Inside was the smoking gun, proof of racketeering, extortion, and years of calculated abuse. When investigators received the evidence, their eyes lit with grim recognition. This wasn't just HOA bullying Anna Maria, it was criminal conspiracy. Within weeks, subpoenas hit every member of the board. Houses that once looked untouchable with their pristine lawns and luxury cars now stood empty as their owners scrambled for lawyers. The community, once shackled by rules, watched in disbelief as the very people who wrote those rules were dragged into court. Karen, brought back in chains for trial, tried to reclaim her old fire. She shouted at the judge, accused the county of staging a witch hunt, even called me a trespasser on my own land again. But every time she opened her mouth, another piece of evidence silenced her. Gloria's testimony, the ranger's report, the financial records, it all stacked into a wall too high for her shrill voice to scale. When the verdict came down guilty on multiple counts of fraud, harassment, and filing false police reports, the room didn't erupt in cheers. It was quieter than that, more powerful. It was the sound of a community finally breathing free. The sentence was severe. Years in prison, restitution to every neighbor she had exploited, and a permanent ban from any leadership or administrative role for life. For someone who had lived off control, it was the cruelest justice, powerless. Her voice stripped of authority. She wailed as deputies led her away, but this time no one even flinched. But the most important part of the story wasn't her fallout, was what rose in her absence. Without Karen's iron grip, the HOA collapsed entirely. Neighbors voted to dissolve it and replace it with a volunteer association focused not on punishment but on cooperation. Instead of Karen's monthly fine letters, there were newsletters about cookouts, trail cleanups, and heritage tours of the cabin yard. Families who once crossed the street to avoid each other now sat together at long picnic tables, laughing under string lights. The cabin itself transformed into a community symbol. With the state's protection, it became a heritage site where children came on school trips, where veterans gathered around campfires to share stories, where hikers stopped to rest by the creek that Karen once tried to claim. Ranger Hollis returned often, smiling as he pointed out how the endangered owls were thriving. Life always finds its way back, he told us. And he was right. The land healed. The people healed. One summer evening at the first official community festival, Mrs. Jensen, who had once been fined for planting daisies instead of roses, stood on the cabin porch with tears streaming down her face. "I used to be afraid to open my mailbox," she said, her voice trembling. "Now I open my door and see friends. That's what this place was meant to be." Applause thundered through the valley, echoing off the mountains like a promise. Karen became nothing more than a cautionary tale. Her name whispered in HOA meetings across the state, her mugshot printed in training manuals about abuse of power. Even in prison, word spread that she tried to control other inmates, but nobody cared. Her reign was over. Her empire dissolved into dust. And as I sit on my porch tonight, the sun dipping low over the mountains, I hear the creek rushing steady, the laughter of children chasing fireflies, the murmur of neighbors who no longer fear fines or harassment. I look at the wooden sign we hung near the cabin entrance, carved by hand. "Truth lives here." Karen sicked the cops on me, but her plan imploded, crushing her instead. And in that collapse, we found freedom, resilience, and the strength to build something lasting. So now I ask you, when someone abuses law and power to terrorize their neighbors, is their disgrace and ruin enough punishment, or should their crimes demand an even heavier price?